Thank you. Immigration is a very controversial. The libertarian position on immigration is a very controversial position. Probably one of our most controversial. If you go by typical polls and the average opinion of the Americans, but my position tonight is that if they really knew what immigration laws were about and what the effects of these laws are on the day-to-day lives of people, that there's hardly an American in this country who would favor these policies. The first reaction of most people when you say what the libertarian policy on this is, well, first the libertarian policy on this is that we should open the borders completely and that anyone can move in or out of any country. The first reaction to this policy is that, of course, that would mean that we all lose our jobs. All of these foreigners would come in and take our jobs, and so we'd be poorer as a result of the free movement of people. This kind of argument is offered by both liberals and conservatives in the establishment. The liberals, for example, would support the union position that we have to protect the existing jobs of the unions in the United States. Liberals would probably also argue that this policy would lead to the failure of the welfare system in the United States. Now, I think that latter argument is true, and that's one of the reasons I support free immigration. But we'll go into that, what we could call a humanitarian argument about the welfare system again later. But before launching into these sort of moral arguments about whether it's right or not, we should go into a little bit about the economics behind it. You know, what really would happen if people were free to move into the United States at will, or out of the United States at will, which they can do now. Well, I think it's probably instructive to look at what happened in American history when they could move into the United States at will. There were long periods of the United States history when there was no immigration service, when there was no way even to enforce it if there was an immigration service. People were landing, there was nobody there to line them up and put them through the works. There was nobody to charge them fees to enter. There was no one to give them forms to fill out. There was just nobody to do the work, and so people were coming in at will. Were the jobs threatened at that time? Were people massively unemployed, or were people given hardships because this freedom was allowed? Well, there's no evidence for that. In fact, during the period of some of the greatest growth of the United States economically, which, for example, say from 1850 to the 1930 period when we had a depression, but during that whole period of tremendous economic growth, there were, on 6 different occasions, over 1 million new immigrants let into the country in 1 year, on 6 different occasions. Now, that's far more than are being let in now, and yet the population now is so much greater that the proportion that would have any effect on jobs and such things is minuscule now compared to what it was then. So in those days when we were all benefiting tremendously economically, nonetheless there was a complete freedom of immigration. Now, actually that last statement isn't true. We had an immigration service even toward the end of the 19th century, but it wasn't practiced too much except against the Chinese on the West Coast, because the Chinese were considered a kind of foreign yellow horde who were taking American jobs, and they had different cultural patterns and so on. So there was a big racist fight against the Chinese during the time of the gold rush and then during the latter part of the 19th century. But other than that exception, there was no immigration restrictions. Even in that case, there was almost 10% of the workforce in California was Chinese, so they obviously weren't too effective in keeping people out. But besides this sort of historical overview, there's just basic economics argues for the fact that the more opportunities you allow people to do whatever they want, whether it happens to be moving from one physical location to another, or getting a job of some new description, or whatever opportunities you deny people, that's not going to help jobs. That's not going to help the average wealth of the populace either. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's any restrictions on opportunities which are the obstacles to wealth. Wealth is only created by people finding opportunities. What some economists call entrepreneurship, the finding of new opportunities that other people hadn't noticed yet. That's the main prime mover behind any economy. And any economy that you look at that's quickly developing invariably is an economy that has a small number of those kinds of restrictions. It's important that many economists will recognize this argument about, say, protectionism. They'll say, of course it's true that if we prohibit foreign goods from entering the United States, that's going to hurt both people in the United States and the people in the other countries. Almost any economists from different perspectives would all agree that protectionism is counterproductive when it is applied to free trade, or what's called laissez-faire. But when it's applied to laissez-passer, or the free movement of people, the free passing of people, which is laborers, which happens to be one of the major exchanged items, if you want to call it that, that's in the economy. It has a part in every kind of production good. So the same argument should apply to free immigration, therefore. Every opportunity that could be grabbed by people who are free to move from one country to another would be obstructed by an immigration policy. So it's not just a matter of protecting existing jobs, it's a matter of finding out new jobs. I think also an important point that was raised by a famous development economist called P.T. Bauer is his argument that with every mouth that comes into a country comes two hands, with few exceptions. And that's, I think, an important point, that it's not just the people are coming in as helpless victims who are washing onto our shores and then have to be taken care of somehow. The fact is that the illegal immigrants in the United States are much harder working on average than typical Americans. Hardly any of them are on welfare. Hardly any of them even use social services. For example, there was a study conducted in San Diego where, of course, most of the Mexican, or a great proportion of the Mexican immigrants come into that city. There was a study made whereby some $98 million was spent in 1 year by the illegal aliens. Of course, this is a vague estimate. You can't really measure this because you don't know how many are illegal and so on. But just the magnitude of these numbers is enough to impress someone, I think. $98 million spent in tax money by illegal aliens in the county of San Diego. And the amount of social services, counting all things, hospitals, schools, every kind of social service, and giving a dollar value to all of these, amounted to $2 million compared to the $98 million. And I think that's very typical. The fact is, of course, that people who have the courage to come to a different country, a different culture, in many cases a completely different language that they have to learn from scratch, with virtually no skills in many cases, although a lot of the new illegal immigrants who come in for the last 20 years are much better skilled than the traditional so-called wetback that people used to talk about. Many of them are well educated. The average education of an immigrant now is about 12th grade, which is, I think, if you go by real literacy, they probably can read better than the product of the American public school system. I think another just interesting statistic that struck me when I read it the other day was at the turn of the century in this country, over a third of the people were either immigrants or immediate sons or daughters of immigrants. A third of the population of the United States. That's changed somewhat since restrictions have been put up. But I think it's also interesting to note that the amount of growth that the United States economy has enjoyed has also diminished during the times when its immigration policies have been tighter. So in other words, I would argue that free immigration not only does not take away jobs and worsen our economic situation, in fact, free immigration is one of the main stimuli of the economy in the United States. And one of the main reasons the United States economy has been so much more prosperous than most of the other economies in the world in the 20th century. Okay, but one can go on with these sort of economic arguments. I think they're fairly well established because they've already been accepted in the case of free movement of goods, and labor can be thought of, some people think of it as callous to think of them that way, but labor can be thought of as a good because, in fact, people exchange the good for a price, and all of the laws of economics that would apply to any good would apply to a laborer. There are also some unique circumstances of the laborer. For example, if he's denied his job, he may be in a tougher position than an owner of a lot of goods who's selling them. And in fact, that gives all the more reason to allow people to exchange their labor as freely as possible, since it's so important to them. In the case, of course, of immigration, we're talking about extreme differences in wages. The typical Mexican laborer within Mexico, for example, earns some 45 cents an hour in many cases, whereas he can earn some 10 times that in many cases just by crossing the border. It's not too surprising that many of them are trying to cross the border. What I think is morally surprising is that they're being shot at just for doing that, for doing something that any of us would do, trying to find a better job, trying to improve their life and feed their families. This brings us then to the moral argument, and I think one can conduct a moral argument even if you wipe away everything I've said so far about the economic argument. Even if it were true that illegal immigrants were taking American jobs and were making it more difficult in certain marginal ways, perhaps, for Americans to earn their living, which I've just been arguing is just the opposite of the truth. But even if it were true, what kind of moral argument can be made for the policies of the Immigration Service, as it's called? First of all, is in general, what right does anyone have to decide where one person moves to another place? You know, just in very broad terms, how can one construct an argument that says, if I'm on this side of the room, you have the right to keep me from being on that side of the room, even if you would in some way be hurt by my being over there? It doesn't seem to me that there's any ethical argument that can be constructed to make that kind of case. The physical location of a person has nothing to do with his ethical rights. Of course, if he happens to be on your personal property, sitting in your living room or something, you have a right to throw him out of that. But certainly the United States is not the personal property of anybody, and someone can be in the United States without even any one of us knowing it, none, much less being annoyed by it or anything. So it seems to me that there's no, in very broad terms, there's no general argument to be made for any kind of immigration policy. Secondly, if we get into more detail about what exactly is being done to people, in most of the third world countries where people are most desperate to come to the United States, it's not just that they want to come here to get a job. Many of them want to come here because if they don't leave their present country, they're going to continue to be tortured by their present government. They're going to continue to have their families thrown in jail. They have no rights of free speech or any of the kinds of things that we enjoy so casually, such as in a meeting like this. People who had denied all these basic rights, it seems to me, have a very good argument for being able at least to come here and be free from that kind of thing. And it seems to me, especially in the case of torture. Now, Amnesty International, which is an organization I've supported on a number of occasions, documents thousands of cases mainly in Latin America and in certain Asian countries, where a simple change in policy by the Immigration and Naturalization Service within the United States would remove a torturer's knife from somebody's body. I mean, it comes down to that. So that means that it's our policy. We are partly, the United States government is partly responsible for torture that goes on in the world. Not only in the ways that the previous panel discussed, I'm sure, if they talked about El Salvador, the United States has complicity in imposing these regimes in the first place and making it more likely that those dictators had the power to impose such inhuman policies on the part of these governments. Not only in that way are we responsible, but we're also responsible on an individual basis for every individual out there who can't come to the United States, because those governments have said that they would be glad to get rid of these troublemakers. They'd be glad to send them to the United States, but they can't because the Immigration and Naturalization Service won't let them. And so instead they stay in the prisons and be tortured by sadistic prison guards. And it seems to me that for this reason, if for none of the others, that abolishes all economic arguments for competing against your job. I mean, a person can compete against my job all he wants if that's the only way he can escape from a torturer. And I don't see how anyone can argue otherwise. The last point, which is probably the most commonly raised argument about immigration, and I'll just briefly talk about it so other people can talk, is the welfare argument. The welfare system is going to be in trouble if we allow people to come from anywhere in the world to live here. Now, of course, I've already mentioned that, in fact, illegal aliens, when they come here, are usually the hardest working people. They're not the people who go on welfare. But even beyond that, I think it is true that if we allowed anyone to come to the United States, and we allowed them to go on welfare, which is not legal now, they're not allowed to take welfare. But if we allowed these two things to happen, the welfare system would collapse. There's no way that the productive people within the United States society could afford to support all of the poor of the world who would come here if they had the chance to come here. Now, does this mean that there's a humanitarian argument against letting these people in here? It doesn't seem to me that there is, because if by humanitarian you mean human, you mean all people who are human ought to be treated with certain respect and ought to be, we ought to take every action we can to improve their plight, then the immigration policy is only saying that to protect the special privileges of some of the richest people within the world, we should exclude all the poorest people in the world from any of these privileges. And that's argued on some kind of humanitarian grounds. That's what the welfare argument comes down to. It's saying that since we couldn't support everyone on a welfare system, therefore we should only support the ones who are already living here and already enjoying the benefits of the United States economy. And we should leave to starvation all the people who can't get into this country. So you could maybe make a word like American-nanitarian or something, which refers to helping some kind of humanitarian attitude that's racist or culturalist and directed only at one small group of people. That you might be able to construct. But I think most of the support for welfare in propaganda would be quickly dissipated if you had to use that kind of argument. Lastly, I just would like to summarize a couple of the things that the Immigration Service accomplishes. I've had a little personal experience with this because a person I'm very close to fought the INS for a while, and I had to help her to get to her native country, and I had sort of followed her around, standing in lines with her and watching her being berated by some bureaucrat in an office who told her she didn't have the right papers for this and that. And I think of all of this experience in my own life, the most striking to me was when I was at the embassy in the foreign country where she was from. And I was standing there in line for some 6 hours with lots of other people who had had no contact with the United States, who had no idea what the United States was, but they all were suffering day after day, being berated like this in order to find some way of getting here. And the one symbol that we found when we come to this office is a plaque on the back of the wall behind the berating bureaucrat of a picture of smiling Jimmy Carter. And that was the only thing that they saw of the United States. And that was the thing that when I came to visit there that was closest to home, that brought back memories for me of what the United States was about. And I think that's really symbolic, that is the end of the United States that they see. They see the Jimmy Carters and the bureaucrats. Now I'm sure there's a smiling picture of Ronnie. But the immigration policy has changed not a whit. There's been a recent study by one of Ronnie's little commissions to study things, which has decided that their solution to the immigration situation is to allow a marginal degree more legal immigrants, and then to tighten up on the border patrol. In other words, get better sharpsmen to shoot at the people who are running across the border and so on. So on that note, I think I'll leave it to some other people to describe in more detail the actual situation in the Third World, which a free immigration policy is at least one modest step to try to rectify. Thank you.